My name is Isabella Thorne. I am 33 years old, and last month my parents booked a $52,000 luxury family vacation for everyone except me. Instead of a first-class plane ticket to the Swiss Alps, my mother left me a yellow sticky note on the granite kitchen island. It said, "Water the bonsai garden twice a day, scrub the pool tiles, and walk the dogs every morning and evening." I found that note sitting right next to the printed receipt for 5 luxury ski passes, a 5-star private chalet, and helicopter tours for my brother and his girlfriend. $52,000 for a trip I was not even invited to. That was the exact second I stopped being their invisible, unpaid servant. I stopped cleaning, I stopped hovering, and I started calculating. 2 weeks later, at their grand New Year Day brunch with 35 elite guests watching, I handed them a legal folder that turned my father's face gray and made my mother collapse into her chair. Before I continue with how I dismantled their perfect world, please take a second to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now, and have you ever been the child who was treated like a guest in their own home while everyone else got the red carpet? I read every single one of your stories, and they helped me realize I am not alone in this. To understand the cold rage that settled into my bones that day, you have to see where I was sitting when it happened. I was in my parents' home office, or more accurately, the windowless corner of the laundry room where they let me keep my desk. I have lived in this house my entire life, mostly in the shadows, working as a remote accountant while handling every domestic crisis my parents could invent. My mother, Eleanor, walked in without knocking. She never knocks. She placed that piece of paper next to my laptop and tapped it twice with her perfectly manicured nail. "We are leaving for Switzerland tomorrow," she said, her voice bright and hollow. "Here is the list of what needs to be done while we are gone." I looked at the demands: water the expensive orchids with distilled water only, shovel the driveway if it frosts, and accept all the high-end packages they had ordered for their trip. I looked up at her and asked, "What time should I be ready to head to the airport tomorrow?" Eleanor looked at me as if I had spoken a dead language. "Ready?" "Isabella, someone reliable needs to stay and watch the estate," she said, smoothing her cashmere blouse. "You know your brother Sebastian cannot miss this. He has been so stressed with his new Manhattan loft, and he is bringing his girlfriend to meet the family. Sebastian is my 29-year-old brother. He is the golden child who had his Ivy League tuition paid in full, $210,000 of my parents' money. He is the one who got a silver Porsche for his graduation and whose $3,500 a month rent shows up on our parents' credit card statements every single month. My parents told me years ago that it was not practical to pay for a girl to go to college. They said I should learn something useful at home instead. So, while Sebastian was at fraternity parties, I learned how to cook, how to clean, and how to keep my mouth shut. "Okay," I said quietly, just like I always did. My mother nodded, already walking away to pack her designer luggage. "Oh, and Isabella, do not kill the bonsai garden like last time," she added before disappearing upstairs. I sat there in that laundry room, staring at the chore list. Something was different this time. The silence of the house felt heavy, like the air before a storm. That night, I sat on my secondhand mattress in my small room, listening to my dog, Luna, breathe. She was the only thing in that house that was truly mine. My laptop pinged with an email notification I almost ignored. It was a forwarded message my mother had sent to my father, Alistair, but she had accidentally copied me on the thread. The subject line read, "Booking confirmation for St. Moritz." I opened it. 5 guests, private chefs, spa packages, first-class flights. The total was $52,000. I read that number 3 times. Then I looked around my room, the flickering lamp, the desk I had found on a curb 6 years ago, and the concrete walls that stayed cold no matter how high the heat was turned up. I thought about my grandfather. I spent 5 years of my life as his full-time caregiver. I fed him, bathed him, and sat with him through the long nights when he was scared. My mother had told me then that family does not pay family. But I saw the receipt. My parents were paying $52,000 for a 10-day vacation for Sebastian, while I was being left behind to scrub their floors. Something shifted inside me, a cold, quiet realization. that there was no going back. I opened a new browser tab and typed 4 words, how to check credit report. I thought I was just unlucky. I thought I was staying in this house because I was a failure who could never get approved for an apartment or a car loan. The report took 3 minutes to generate. It took me 20 minutes to stop shaking. There were 4 credit cards in my name, all opened when I was 19 years old, the exact year my mother convinced me to stay home instead of applying for school. The total balance was $74,000. The charges were for designer furniture from Pottery Barn, first-class flights to Dubai, and shopping sprees at luxury boutiques. The billing address for every single card was this house. My parents had not just ignored me. They had stolen my name, my social security number, and my entire future to furnish their living room and take tropical vacations while I slept in a room next to the washing machine. They had trapped me in this house by burying me in debt I knew nothing about. I did not scream. I did not cry. The rage that came was cold and calculated. I closed the credit report and opened my contacts. I searched for a name I had not spoken in years, an old friend who had become a high-stakes litigation lawyer. I realized if I stayed silent, I would be their servant until they died, with no salary, no breaks, and no life of my own. I looked at the first snowflakes beginning to fall outside my tiny window. I had exactly 2 weeks while they were in Switzerland to figure out what came next. I was done being invisible. The black SUV pulled out of the driveway at 4 a.m, leaving a trail of exhaust that lingered in the freezing air like a ghost. I stood at the window of the laundry room, watching the red taillights vanish around the corner. For the first time in years, the house was silent. There was no shouting from Sebastian about a misplaced charging cable, no sharp demands from my mother about the dinner menu, and no heavy, judgmental sighs from my father. It was just me and Luna. I looked down at the yellow sticky notes still sitting on the granite island, the list of chores glowing under the microwave light: scrub the pool tiles, water the bonsai, walk the dogs. I felt a strange, cold vibration in my chest, a frequency I hadn't tuned into since I was 18 years old. It was the sound of a door finally being unlocked. I didn't start the chores. I didn't even pick up the dry cleaning. Instead, I walked into my father's study. The room smelled of expensive leather and aged scotch, a world built on a foundation of success that I now realized was at least partially subsidized by my own erasure. I sat in his heavy oak chair and opened my laptop. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my fingers were steady. The analytical part of my brain, the accountant who survived on data and precision, had taken the wheel. I navigated to a site I had been afraid to visit for a decade. I typed in my social security number, my full legal name, and my birth date. The screen flickered white for 3 seconds while the report generated. Those 3 seconds felt like an eternity. I thought about every time I had tried to move out. I remembered 3 years ago when I found a beautiful sunlit studio near my office. I had saved enough for a security deposit, but the landlord had called me 2 days later with a voice full of forced apology. He said, "Isabella, I am sorry, but your credit score is in the basement. I cannot take the risk." I had come home and cried on the laundry room floor, and my mother had hugged me, telling me that some people are just not naturally good with finances. She said I was lucky to have a family that would always keep a roof over my head. The report loaded. I didn't breathe for a full minute. There it was, laid out in black and white, a digital roadmap of a betrayal I could barely comprehend. My credit score was a 420. But it wasn't because of my own choices. I scrolled down to the active accounts. There were 4 credit cards I had never applied for, 2 high-interest personal loans, and a line of credit for a luxury furniture store. All of them had been opened when I was 19 years old. That was the year I had begged to go to university, and Alistair had told me they couldn't afford it. The year Eleanor told me that girls find a way and that I should stay home and learn how to manage a household instead. I scrolled through the transaction history, and the room began to spin. August 2018, $6,000 for first-class flights to Dubai. November 2019, $8,000 at a boutique furniture gallery. May 2021, a series of charges at high-end designer stores in New York City. The same month, Sebastian moved into his Manhattan loft. The billing address for every single one of these accounts was this house, my parents' house. The total balance across all accounts was $74,312. I leaned back in the chair, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. They hadn't just used my labor to keep their house running. They had used my identity as a shield. Every time they wanted a luxury they couldn't quite justify, they put it in my name. Every time they took a trip that was slightly over budget, they used my social security number to buy the tickets. They had intentionally destroyed my financial future to ensure I would never be able to leave them. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a permanent, unpaid domestic worker who was legally tethered to their basement because no landlord or bank in the country would touch her. I looked at the dates again. These cards were still active. There was a charge from 3 days ago, a $500 deposit for a spa treatment at the very resort in Switzerland they were currently enjoying. They were sitting in the Alps, drinking champagne and getting massages, and they were charging it to a credit card that was slowly suffocating me. The rage didn't come as a heat. It was a cold, Arctic wind that settled into my bones. For 13 years, I had lived in shame, believing I was a failure. I had worked 3 remote jobs, saving every penny I could, only to find out that no matter how hard I worked, I was running on a treadmill that was designed to go nowhere. I looked at Luna, who was watching me with her head tilted, sensing the shift in the air. "I am not unlucky," I whispered to the empty room. "I am being robbed." I closed the browser and opened my private email. I didn't cry. I didn't call my mother to confront her. I knew exactly how that would go. She would cry, tell me it was a mistake, and then Alistair would tell me that I was being ungrateful for the food they put on my table. No, words were useless now. I needed a different kind of language. I reached out to Cassandra, my old friend from high school who was now a partner at a litigation firm. I didn't give her the emotional details. I sent her a PDF of the credit report and a single sentence. "I need to file a police report for identity theft, and I need to know the legal requirements for a mechanic's lien on a private residence." I stood up and walked out of the study, leaving the smell of scotch behind. I went down to the laundry room and looked at my desk. It was small, cramped, and pathetic. I realized then that I wasn't just staying in this house because I was poor. I was being held hostage by the people who claimed to be my protectors. I looked at the chore list on the counter one last time. I didn't tear it up. I simply left it there, a testament to the life I was officially resigning from. I had 2 weeks, 14 days while they were trapped on a mountain in Switzerland, blissfully unaware that the invisible girl they left behind had finally turned on the lights. I wasn't going to be their maid anymore. I was going to be their reckoning. 2 days after the black SUV disappeared toward the airport, I found myself sitting in a cramped, brightly lit office downtown. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and old paper, a stark contrast to the expensive mahogany and Scotch scent of my father Alistair's study. Across from me sat Julian Vance, a forensic accountant with graying hair and a pair of spectacles that seemed to magnify the intensity of his gaze. Julian was a man who lived in the world of cold, hard facts. He didn't care about family loyalty or the emotional weight of a mother's guilt. He cared about line items, fair market value, and the undeniable truth of a spreadsheet. I placed a thick folder on his desk. Inside were the credit reports, the emails I had unearthed, and a handwritten log I had kept for nearly 2 decades without even realizing why. For 18 years, I had been the silent engine of the Thorne estate. While Sebastian was out being the golden child, I was the one scrubbing the grease off the stovetop, managing the grocery budgets, and ensuring every orchid in the greenhouse stayed alive. "Let us calculate exactly what you are owed, Isabella," Julian said, clicking his pen. His voice was neutral, almost clinical. It was exactly what I needed. We started with the general domestic labor. For 18 years, I had handled the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, and the property management for a 6,000 square foot estate. We calculated 15 hours a week for the early years, ballooning to 40 hours a week once I graduated high school and was forced to stay home. Julian used a conservative rate of $20 an hour, the average for a professional housekeeper in our area. He wrote the first number on his legal pad, $295,000. I stared at the ink. It looked so small on the paper, yet it represented every Saturday I spent mopping floors while my brother went to the movies. It represented every holiday I spent in the kitchen while my parents entertained guests who didn't even know my name. Then we got to the heavy part. My grandfather. For 5 years, I was his primary caregiver. I wasn't just a granddaughter visiting on weekends. I was the person who changed his bandages, managed his 11 different medications, and sat with him through the terrifying nights when his dementia made him forget who I was. My mother, Eleanor, had told me then that family does not pay family. She said that caring for my grandfather was my contribution to the household. But Julian didn't see it that way. He looked up the market rate for a certified home health aide. I need to pause here for a moment. If you have ever been the responsible one in your family, the one who always shows up, always helps, and always sacrifices only to feel completely invisible, I see you. If this story is making you realize that your time and your life have actual value, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me know that these stories of reclaiming our worth are reaching the people who need to hear them most. And tell me in the comments, if you had to send a bill to the people who took advantage of your kindness, what would that total look like? I read every single one of your responses, and they remind me why we cannot stay silent anymore. Julian continued his math. 5 years of full-time caregiving, 40 hours a week, at a minimum of $25 an hour. That was another $260,000. But then, Julian leaned back. He explained that we had to be fair if this was going to hold up in court or as a legal lien. We had to subtract the fair market value of my room and board. Even for a windowless corner of the laundry room, there was a cost. He calculated a deduction of approximately $140,000 over those 18 years. He circled the final figure at the bottom of the page. It was bold. It was terrifying. $415,000. I stared at that number until the digits blurred. That can't be right, I whispered. It feels like too much. Julian adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a rare moment of sympathy. Isabella, this is actually a conservative estimate. I didn't include overtime, holiday pay, or the emotional labor of hospice care. Your parents didn't just save money by keeping you at home. They built their entire lifestyle on the back of your unpaid labor. You were a one-woman staff that cost them nothing. But I needed more than just Julian's math. I needed the proof that this was more than a gift. I went hunting through my old emails, searching for the digital breadcrumbs my mother had left behind. I found a message from 2019, the year my grandfather's health took its final grueling turn. Eleanor had written, Isabella, I know this is a lot to ask, but family takes care of family. When your grandfather's estate is settled and things get better, we will make it up to you. We will figure out something fair, I promise. She never figured out anything fair. She never settled the debt. Instead, she took the inheritance from my grandfather and used it to buy Sebastian's Porsche and fund the $52,000 trip they were currently enjoying. Julian flipped to the final page of the report, the part that dealt with the identity theft. Isabella, I found something else. One of the cards they opened in your name? It is still active. There was a purchase just made 3 days ago, a spa treatment at the resort in St. Moritz. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. They were still using me. They were sitting in the Alps, getting massages paid for with credit I would have to answer for, while I sat in a sterile office trying to find a reason to keep living. They hadn't just exploited my past, they were currently consuming my future. Julian closed the folder with a firm thud. Your parents have treated you like a ghost for 18 years, Isabella. But ghosts don't send invoices. You are a woman with a $415,000 claim and a $74,000 case for identity theft. Are you ready to stop being a ghost? I thought about the yellow sticky notes sitting on the kitchen island. I thought about the bonsai trees I wasn't going to water and the pool I wasn't going to scrub. I looked at Julian and nodded. The invisible girl was dead. The creditor had arrived. I had exactly 10 days before they returned from the snow, and by the time they walked through that front door, they wouldn't find a daughter waiting to serve them. They would find a 40-page legal document and a reckoning that had been 18 years in the making. The silence that followed the departure of the black SUV was not empty. It was a heavy, expectant thing, like the air in a courtroom just before a verdict is read. For 33 years, the Thorne estate had been a place of noise and demands, a constant cycle of Isabella, do this and Isabella, why is this not done? But now, with Eleanor, Alistair, and Sebastian 5,000 miles away in the Swiss Alps, the 6,000 square foot mansion felt like a hollow shell. I stood in the center of the kitchen, looking at the yellow sticky note my mother had left on the granite island. The list of chores was a testament to how they viewed me, a biological appliance that didn't need rest or respect. I didn't pick up the note, I didn't even move it. I simply let it sit there, a small, arrogant scrap of paper. My rebellion did not begin with a scream. It began with a cardboard box. I went to the laundry room, to that windowless corner where they had allowed me to exist, and I started pulling out the few things that were actually mine. It is a sobering realization when 33 years of life fit into 6 medium-sized boxes. I packed my clothes, my laptop, a few books, and my important documents. Deep at the bottom of a plastic bin, I found the most important paper of all, Luna's registration certificate. I had been 20 years old when I got her, and even then, I had possessed enough foresight to put my name on the line marked owner. My mother had always called her the family dog, but the state of Washington knew she was mine. I photographed the document and uploaded it to the cloud. I sent a copy to Cassandra, my lawyer, with a note. The asset is secured. The move happened in increments. Every day for the next 10 days, while my family was posting photos of themselves drinking $50 hot chocolates in St. Moritz, I was quietly dismantling my presence in their house. By day 4, my room looked almost normal to a casual observer, but the soul of it was gone. By day 8, it was an empty shell of concrete and flickering light. I had found a studio apartment downtown, located above a quiet bookstore. It was small, barely the size of my parents' walk-in closet, but it had something the Thorne estate never offered me. Actual windows. The sunlight that poured across the hardwood floors felt like a benediction. I had paid the first and last month's rent from my private savings, the small account I had managed to build through years of remote accounting work that I did in the middle of the night after my chores were finished. My parents never knew about that money. They thought I was as broke as they wanted me to be. Back at the mansion, the neglect began to manifest. The expensive orchids and the meticulously manicured bonsai garden were the first to show the signs. These plants were Eleanor's pride, delicate and demanding things that required distilled water and constant attention. I watched them wilt. I watched the leaves turn from a vibrant, arrogant green to a sickly, defeated brown. I felt a strange sense of kinship with them. We had both been kept in this house to look pretty and serve a purpose, but unlike the orchids, I was finally choosing to stop growing for people who never gave me enough light. The mail began to pile up in the foyer. Designer catalogs, utility bills, and luxury credit card statements sat in a mounting heap behind the front door. The dry cleaning stayed at the cleaners. The pool water turned a murky, unappealing shade of gray. I walked through the house like a ghost, witnessing the slow decay of the Thorne perfection. On the 5th day, I met Cassandra at her office. She had the paperwork ready. Isabella, a mechanic's lien is a powerful legal tool, she explained, her voice sharp and professional. It is typically used by contractors who perform work on a property and are not paid. By filing this, we are declaring that your 18 years of domestic labor and 5 years of caregiving were professional services for which you were never compensated. I read the document. The total was listed in bold, black ink, $415,000. By signing this, I was placing a legal claim against the Thorne estate. My parents would not be able to sell the house, refinance their mortgage, or take out any more lines of credit until this debt was resolved. It was the ultimate accounting. They had treated me like a servant, so I was finally giving them the bill for my service. I signed my name with a steady hand. I felt a surge of cold, analytical satisfaction. This was the language my father understood. He didn't understand tears or pleas for equality, but he understood a lien. He understood a frozen asset. On the 10th day, my phone buzzed with a call from Switzerland. It was my mother. Isabella, she began, her voice sounding distant and distracted by the wind. Mrs. Henderson from across the street said the driveway hasn't been shoveled and she hasn't seen you outside in days. Is everything okay? Everything is fine, Mom, I said, keeping my voice neutral and empty. I have just been very busy. Well, make sure you clear the snow before we get back. Alistair hates a messy walk, she said, her tone dismissive. We will be home in 2 days. Have the smoked salmon and the mimosas ready for the New Year brunch. Sebastian's girlfriend is expecting a traditional thorn welcome. I will be there, I promised, and I meant it. But the traditional thorn welcome was about to include a reality check they never saw coming. That night, I moved the last of my things, my pillow, my toiletries, and Luna's favorite blanket. I stood in the empty laundry room one last time. The yellow walls seemed to mock me, a remnant of a girl who had spent a decade waiting to be seen. I turned off the light and didn't look back. I drove to my new studio, where Luna was already curled up in a patch of moonlight. I had spent my entire life being the person who fixed things, the person who kept the thorn world from falling apart. But for the next 48 hours, I was going to let it crumble. The invoices were printed, the lien was filed, and the invisible girl was gone. My family was flying home to a house that was legally half mine and a daughter who was no longer for sale. I sat by my new window, watching the city lights, and for the first time in 33 years, I breathed air that didn't belong to Alistair and Eleanor Thorne. The reckoning was 48 hours away, and I had never been more ready. January 1st arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I heard later from my Aunt Patricia that the morning at the Thorne estate was nothing short of a forensic disaster. My mother, Eleanor, had come downstairs at 5 a.m. expecting to find the kitchen smelling of smoked salmon and fresh pastries. Instead, she found a cold stove, empty counters, and the deafening silence of a daughter who was no longer there to serve. When she threw open the door to my laundry room corner and found it stripped bare, no bed, no desk, no trace of the girl she had exploited for decades, her panic was immediate. She called my phone 16 times. I didn't answer once. By 9:30 a.m., she had been forced to order emergency catering from the most expensive hotel in the city, paying triple the holiday rate, just to keep up appearances for the 35 elite guests who were already beginning to pull into the driveway. I arrived at exactly 10:45 a.m. I didn't use the back door. I walked straight up the front path, past the Hendersons' luxury sedan and the Morgans' pristine SUV. I wasn't wearing an apron, and I didn't have flour on my hands. I wore a sharp, charcoal blazer and pressed slacks, my hair pulled back with a precision that mirrored the data I was carrying. Beside me, Luna trotted on her leash, her head held high. Through the massive front windows, I could see the living room crowded with people in cashmere and silk, sipping mimosas I hadn't poured. I want to pause here for a moment. If you are listening to this and you feel that familiar tightening in your chest, the one where you realize you are about to lose a family, but finally find yourself, then please hit that like button. Subscribe to join a community of people who are tired of being the secret behind someone else's success. And let me know in the comments, would you have the courage to hand over that envelope in front of 35 people? Or would you have walked away in silence? I read every single one of your stories, and your courage is why I'm telling mine. I pushed open the heavy oak door. The hum of conversation died down as I stepped into the foyer. My father, Alistair, stood by the fireplace, a glass of scotch already in his hand despite the hour. My mother recovered first, her hostess mask snapping into place with a terrifying speed. "Isabella, sweetie," she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the room for the benefit of the audience. "We were so worried. Are you feeling better? We thought you were upstairs resting." I didn't move toward her. I stood in the center of the rug, the black manila envelope held firmly at my side. "I have never felt better, Mom," I said, my voice steady and factual. Alistair stepped forward, his face tightening into a mask of redirected anger. "Where have you been? And why is that dog in the house? Put her in the laundry room immediately." "Luna is staying with me," I replied. "And I'm not here to work. I'm here to be seen." I felt the room's attention sharpen. Mrs. Henderson paused with a pastry halfway to her mouth. Mr. Morgan set his glass down. My brother Sebastian stood by the window, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Sis, what are you doing?" he muttered. "You're embarrassing Mom and Dad." "I'm not here to embarrass anyone, Sebastian," I said. "I'm here for a long overdue accounting." I opened the envelope. I walked over to the coffee table and laid out the first document. It was the invoice Julian Vance and I had spent hours perfecting. "This is for you, Mom, and you, Dad." It is a formal invoice for 18 years of unpaid domestic labor, housekeeping, cooking, estate management, and 5 years of full-time caregiving for Grandpa. My father snatched the papers, his eyes darting across the numbers. $387,000? He shouted, forgetting the guests for a split second. "This is a joke. You lived here for free." "I lived in a laundry room and worked 40 hours a week for $0. While you used my social security number to fund your lifestyle," I said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. If you turn to page 3, you will see the mechanic's lien I filed against this property on Friday. As of this moment, you cannot sell this house or refinance your mortgage until my services are paid for. The whispers among the guests turned into a low roar. I heard Aunt Patricia step forward from the back of the room. "Charlotte is telling the truth, Alistair," she said, her voice ringing clear. "I've watched you treat her like a servant for 20 years. I'm the one who paid for her accounting certification behind your backs because I knew you'd never let her leave." My mother's face went from pale to a ghostly white. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, but I wasn't done. I pulled out the final document, the credit report. "And this," I said, holding up the page with the $74,000 total circled in red, "is the proof of identity theft. 4 credit cards opened in my name without my consent. Designer furniture, flights to Dubai, and even a spa treatment in St. Moritz 3 days ago, all charged to me while I was home shoveling your snow." "Identity theft?" Mr. Morgan whispered. "That's a federal crime." The room went dead silent. My mother's knees finally gave out, and she collapsed into the armchair, her hands shaking as she stared at the floor. My father opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his life, his authority had no weight. He looked around the room and saw 35 people looking at him not with respect, but with absolute horror. One by one, the guests began to move toward the door. Mrs. Henderson didn't even say goodbye. She just clutched her purse and hurried out. Mr. Morgan followed, giving my father a cold, disappointed nod. Sebastian's girlfriend, Emma, looked at me with tears in her eyes, whispered a quiet, "I'm so sorry," and walked out the door without looking back at my brother. Within 15 minutes, the Thorne estate was empty of its elite guests. The store-bought pastries sat untouched on the table. The mimosas were flat. I stood in the silence of the room, looking at the 2 people who had spent my entire life trying to keep me invisible. They were finally seeing me. But for the first time, I didn't care what they saw. I turned toward the door with Luna, the weight of their secrets finally resting on their shoulders instead of mine. The front door clicked shut behind the last guest, and the silence that followed was heavy, cold, and absolute. I stood in the center of the living room, my charcoal blazer feeling like a suit of armor. My mother, Eleanor, remained slumped in the armchair, her perfectly applied mascara finally beginning to run in dark, jagged tracks down her face. The facade of the Thorne perfection had not just cracked, it had disintegrated in front of 35 of the most influential people in our circle. My father, Alistair, stood by the mahogany coffee table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the legal documents I had just served him. "How could you do this to us?" Eleanor's voice finally broke through the quiet, sounding thin and brittle, like old parchment. She looked at me not with remorse, but with a searing sense of betrayal, as if I were the one who had spent 14 years stealing an identity. "In front of everyone, Isabella? Our friends, our colleagues? You've humiliated us." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar urge to apologize or fix her pain. "How could you do this to me for 14 years? I asked, my voice flat and devoid of the emotional trembles she usually exploited. "You didn't just take my money, Mom. You took my name. You used my social security number to buy spa treatments in Switzerland while I was in the laundry room trying to figure out why no landlord would rent to me. You didn't just exclude me from the family. You used me as a subsidy for a life I wasn't allowed to live." Alistair threw the papers onto the coffee table with a violent slap. "We raised you," he roared, reaching for the authority he had wielded over me since I was a child. "We gave you a roof, clothing, and food. You lived in this house for free while we took care of everything." "I cooked that food myself, Dad," I replied, my gaze never wavering from his. "I mopped the floors under that roof. I managed your estate, handled your bills, and gave 5 years of my life to caring for Grandpa while you were taking tropical vacations on my credit cards. By every professional standard, I have been your employee, and you are currently in arrears for $415,000. My brother Sebastian finally looked up from his phone. The golden child looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his Manhattan arrogance stripped away. "I didn't know about the cards, Isabella," he whispered, and for once, I believed him. He was too self-absorbed to notice the theft, but he was certainly happy to enjoy the silver Porsche and the Ivy League tuition it provided. "I believe you didn't know, Sebastian," I said. "But you knew I was living in a basement-turned-laundry room while you had a luxury loft. You knew I stayed home while you went to college. You knew it was unfair, and you let it happen because it was easier for you." Alistair stepped toward me, his face a deep, dangerous shade of red. "You think you're so smart with these papers? You think a judge is going to side with a daughter suing her own parents? This is extortion." "No, Alistair, this is accountability." I met his glare with a cold, analytical precision. "You worked at a bank for 30 years. You know exactly how a mechanic's lien works. As of 3 days ago, that lien is officially attached to this property. You cannot sell this house, you cannot refinance your debt, and you cannot take out another cent of equity to fund Sebastian's lifestyle until my invoice is settled." Eleanor stood up, her legs unsteady. "You can't just leave us like this. This is your home." I almost laughed, but the sound that came out was more like a dry exhale. "This was never my home," I said, looking around the expensive room that had been furnished with my debt. "This was the place where I worked for free for nearly 2 decades. I am done waiting for you to see me, and I am certainly done being your bank account." I picked up Luna's leash and adjusted the manila envelope under my arm. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the room felt tilted. I was no longer the invisible daughter begging for a seat at the table. I was the creditor holding the keys to their financial stability. "Here is the ultimatum," I stated, looking at both of them. "I'm not asking for the $415,000 today. I know you don't have it. But the $74,000 in identity theft debt, that is a federal crime. You have exactly 90 days to pay off every single one of those fraudulent cards and clear my credit report." "And if we don't?" Alistair asked, his voice harsh and brittle. "Then the lien remains on this house forever," I replied simply. "I will file a formal police report for the identity theft, and I will let the legal system handle the rest." 90 days, Dad. That's the time you have to fix what you've destroyed. After that, I stop being your daughter, and I become your plaintiff." Aunt Patricia moved to my side, her presence a silent but firm endorsement of my stance. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and for the first time in that house, I felt supported. "If you walk out that door with her, Patricia, you're dead to this family." Eleanor shrieked, her hostess mask completely gone, replaced by a desperate, ugly bitterness. Aunt Patricia's smile was tired, but it was the most genuine thing in the room. "I think I'll survive, Linda," she said quietly. We walked toward the front door together. Behind us, I heard Sebastian's voice, small and panicked, asking, "What are we going to do?" I heard my mother's response, sharp and desperate, claiming she would fix it, but even she sounded like she didn't believe it anymore. I stepped out into the biting January air and took a deep, full breath. For 33 years, I had been holding my breath, waiting for permission to exist. As I walked toward my car with Luna, I realized I didn't owe them my silence, my labor, or my future. The debt was theirs now, and for the first time in my life, I was the one walking away with everything that mattered. 6 months have passed since that icy New Year brunch transformed my world from a windowless laundry room into a place of absolute clarity. I am sitting on my balcony today in an apartment that is twice the size of my first studio, watching the summer sun dip behind the Seattle skyline. Luna is lying in a patch of warmth at my feet, slower now and more gray around her muzzle, but her tail still wags with a steady, rhythmic content. For 33 years, I was a ghost in my own family, an unpaid domestic worker whose labor was harvested to fund a life I was never allowed to live. Today, for the first time in my adult life, I am not just surviving. I am truly free. The 90-day ultimatum I gave Alistair and Eleanor Thorne was the most difficult period of my life. My father tried every banking trick in his arsenal to circumvent the mechanic's lien, but as my lawyer Cassandra reminded him, the data was undeniable. You cannot argue with 18 years of notarized bank statements and a certified forensic accounting report. 2 months ago, the notification finally arrived on my phone. A deposit of $74,312 into my account to clear the identity theft debt. The lien was removed, the credit accounts were closed, and my credit score began its slow, painful climb toward recovery. For the first time in 13 years, my financial identity belongs to me and no one else. I want to take a moment to speak to those of you still listening. If you are the person who always does the right thing while everyone else takes the credit, or if you are currently trapped in a situation where family loyalty is being used as a weapon against your future, I see you. If my journey toward freedom has given you the courage to look at your own value, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support allows me to keep telling these stories of justice and reclamation. Tell me in the comments, what is the one boundary you have been afraid to set, and what is stopping you? I read every single one of your responses because your voice is the only thing that can break the silence. The letters from my mother still come once a week. They are written in her perfect, elegant cursive on expensive stationery. She tells me how much she misses me and how devastated she is by my absence. But as I read through them, I notice something chilling. In 6 months of correspondence, she has not once said she is sorry. She has not once acknowledged that stealing my identity was wrong or that treating me like a servant was an abuse of power. She is devastated by the consequences, not the actions. I fold those letters and put them in a box in my closet. They are no longer weapons. They are just proof that I was not imagining the coldness of that house. Aunt Patricia still visits me every weekend. We cook dinner together in my kitchen, a kitchen where I am the guest of honor, not the help. She told me recently that my mother's inability to apologize stems from a lifetime of her own wounds, of never being good enough for her own parents. It helped me understand, but as I told Patricia, understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness is not a requirement for my healing. I have stopped building bridges for people who refuse to meet me halfway. The most unexpected development came 3 weeks ago when there was a knock on my door. I expected a delivery, but instead, I found Sebastian. My brother looked different, thinner, tired, and wearing a beard he had never had before. He sat on my sofa and looked around at the sunlight and the plants on my windowsill. He told me he had broken up with his girlfriend after she walked out of the brunch, and that he had finally stopped taking money from our parents. He said he was an asshole for years because it was easier not to see the truth. He told Alistair and Eleanor that he would not convince me to come back until they offered a real apology. It is microscopic progress, but for the first time, I felt like I had a brother instead of a rival. With the money I saved from my remote accounting work and the raise I received last month, I have officially launched the Resilient Shadow Fund. It is a small nonprofit dedicated to providing legal aid and financial counseling to young women who are being financially abused by their families. We help them pull their credit reports, find safe housing, and understand that their labor has a market value. I spent 18 years in a basement believing I was worthless. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure no one else has to feel that way. The lessons I learned from the Thorne estate were bought with sweat and secrets, but they are yours for free today. First, your labor has value. Do not let anyone, especially family, make you feel guilty for expecting recognition. Second, setting boundaries is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of survival. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot build a life on a foundation of someone else's lies. Third, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one carrying the heaviest truths. When you finally decide to speak, the world will listen. Thank you for being part of this story and for standing with me as I reclaimed my name. If you found value in this conclusion, please share it with someone who might be sitting in their own version of a windowless laundry room today. And if you are ready to see the next story, one about a woman who discovered her husband was leading a double life through their shared bank account, click the video in the description. Take care of yourself, because you are the only person who can truly define your worth.